Okay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who I met just a couple of years ago after I took a course called Reflective Writing for Teachers. And actually the facilitator of that class is here with us today, Niraj Raghavan, welcome. So happy to have you. And I met Deeptha and as an educator, and then later found out that she is a professional storyteller. And I have just more and more have been feeling that storytelling is so important for teachers at every level, even at college level. And so I invited her to come and talk to us about storytelling. She has a lot of interest and experience in using storytelling as a teaching learning methodology. And she is also currently a storytelling consultant at a school in Chandigarh. Chandigarh, I believe, is where you live. Is that correct? Yes. All right. And she works with teachers, including storytelling in their curriculum, in their syllabus, at all different grade levels. So it's really a great honor to have her with us today to share her knowledge, her enthusiasm, and her, I don't know, demeanor, the aura about her is so wonderful. I know that you're all going to feel at ease. So just want to welcome you all and welcome Deeptha, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for that very generous introduction. This is the first time someone's actually talked about my aura. It must be the sunlight that's filtering in through the window. But thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you, and it's great to see some of them. It would be really nice if those of you who are able to turn on your videos can do so. But I understand if you have a bad connection, you can turn that off somewhere along the way. But at least in the beginning, it would be really nice to see your faces. I know half of my reflective writing group is here, so we keep seeing each other quite often. But the rest of you who are from the Language Center and Vicky's MA students, please do turn on your cameras if you can. All right. Should I give you a few seconds to do that? Nobody seems to want to. All right, yes, we've got, oh yay, that's nice. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Great, so this session has been actually quite a few years in the making. Vicky and I have been talking about it for a while, and I'm so glad that she's been able to put this together soon after she came back to India. So again, heartfelt thanks, Vicky. So I've planned the session in 3 parts today, and I'll just quickly take you through how I've planned it. The session I'm calling is The Gift of Story. It's not just storytelling with Deeptha, because I believe that stories are gifts that you give and you receive, and the more you give, the more you receive. It's a gift that never ends. So I'm very happy to be gifting you some stories that I hope you will receive and pass on. So this program today is in 3 parts, the plot, as it were. So the first bit is where we talk a little bit about what a story is and what is storytelling and who is a storyteller. And then as students of literature and those of you who are preparing for careers in teaching, I think you'd be interested to know how to choose and tell a story, and then the role of stories in teaching and learning. So that's really how I've planned the session today. Feel free to stop me at any point to ask a question, or if you'd like to keep them towards the end, that's fine too. So I do have about 10 to 15 minutes planned towards the end. But before we do anything, since this is a session on storytelling, it only makes sense that we start with a story. So I'd like to take you all the way to America, and the America of the indigenous peoples. So the story, excuse me, I'm going to tell you today is called How Stories Came to Be. Can one of you please mute yourself? There's a lot of noise in the background. I don't know who it is, but could you please mute yourself?
Yes, I can't tell either when it's.
Yeah, okay, I think it's fine now. Right.
Okay.
Right. So like I was saying, this is called How Stories Came to Be, and it's a folk tale from the Seneca Indian people. And it goes like this. So if you're ready, once upon a time, excuse me, there's some disturbance. Am I the only one who's hearing this? Can you hear me well?
I can hear you fine. I don't hear any disturbance.
Okay, I'm just going to go on. Yeah. Right. So once long ago, there were no stories in the world. And that made life very, very hard for the people, especially when after a long day's work, they sat around feeling bored and they wished that something interesting could be said, that somebody might say something that was of value. But all they heard was silence and an occasional sigh. Now, among those people, there lived a boy whose name was Gaka, which meant crow. Now, Gaka was called by that name because his clothes were black with soot, and he looked as black as the feathers of a crow. He was an orphan, and he did not have parents to look after him or to help him wear clean clothes or clean his face or comb his hair. And the people made fun of him because of his appearance, but Gaka usually ignored that. One day, Gaka was out hunting. And as he had been out the whole day, he was tired. And so he came to a place to rest. And right there, a great cliff stood. So he decided to sit down and lean against the face of the cliff. He put down his bows and arrows. And the place where the rocks looked out, it formed a face that looked like a man. So Gaka leaned back, stretched his legs, closed his eyes. It was absolutely silent. The wind was not blowing. The birds were not chirping. If only there was something to which I might listen, he said to himself. And right at that time, a deep voice spoke. Shall I tell a story? Gaka looked around. Who just spoke? He asked. I did, said that same deep voice again. And Gaka looked up and he realized it was the rock face that had spoken to him. He was extremely surprised, but he was also curious and a little bit scared at the same time. I don't quite know what a story is, but whatever it is, I would like to hear it. Well, in that case, first, you must give me something, said the stone face. I'll do so gladly, said Gaka, and he placed the birds that he had just hunted at the foot of the cliff. Now I shall tell a story, said the stone. But first, you must answer by saying Neo to show that you are ready to hear. Neo, Gaka said very quickly. Good. Now, whenever I say ho, you must say hen, so that I know that you are still listening, and you must not fall asleep until I have said daneho and my story has ended. And Gaka very quickly agreed to all of these rules, and so began the stone. It started speaking of a story of how the earth came to be and how the heavens were made, how day and night was formed. And Gaka listened. He listened. He listened very closely so that he might remember every single detail so that he may share it with the others back in the longhouse. Finally, as the sun was setting and it was beginning to grow dark, the stone said, Daneho, I have spoken. And so Gaka thanked the great stone for the story and he hurried back to the longhouse. And as usual, the people were sitting around there with nothing to do. Now, no one looked up until Gaka spoke. His voice that day was a lot louder and more confident than it usually was. Shall I tell a story? He asked. Who are you to speak? And why today? They started mocking him. Be quiet now, said the clan mother. Now, every longhouse had a clan mother. Let him speak. Well, I don't know what a story is, but whatever it is, it must be definitely better than sitting here doing nothing. And so Gaka got ready to tell his tale. But he remembered what the stone told him. First, you must give me something, he said. And so the clan mother picked up a small pouch that she had, and it had some clay beads in it, and she gave it to Gaka. Gaka received it, kept it close to his heart, and he started telling them the story that he had just been told by the great stone. And the people listened. They lost track of time, and they listened and listened with rapt attention until at last Gaka said, Daneho, I have spoken. My story has come to an end. That was wonderful. Tell us another one, they asked. But Gaka said, well, you'll have to wait for tomorrow. And so Gaka went back to the great stone the next day, back to the rock face. And he asked, Grandfather, I have come to hear more stories from you. And today he placed the same string of beads that he got yesterday. He said, I have brought you this gift. Shall I tell you a story? Said the rock face. Kneel, said Gaka. And so it went. Every day Gaka would come to the rock face with stones that he received the previous day. And the rock face would in turn give his stories to Gaka. And when Gaka took the stories back to the people, he kept receiving gifts of appreciation from them. He was given clothes and shoes and a comb, a bone comb for his hair. And with every story that Gaka told, he also grew in size. With time, he was no longer a small boy in raggedy clothes and a black streaked face. He was a tall, good-looking, well-dressed man. And the people no longer called him Gaka. He now became Hage Ota, the storyteller. Now, some people tried to find where Gaka got his stories from. They tried to follow him, but all they could see was Gaka sitting against the stone and saying something that sounded like, heh, heh, every now and then. And at last, the day came when Gaka faced the rock for one last time. For the rock said, my dear grandson, I have shared all my stories with you and I have none left to give. The stories no longer belong to me, but to you, and through you to the people. And now, anyone who truly listens to the people may hear a story. And so it is to this day. If you really listen, there's always a story that's waiting to be told. Daneho. That's the end of that story. Thank you for listening. All right, so I'm going to use this story now to kickstart our discussion about what is a story, what is storytelling, and who is a storyteller. So those of you who listened to that story, I know we didn't do the hoe and the hen, but I'm assuming you listened to it without falling off asleep. So tell me, what did this story mean to you when you were listening? What kind of images came up in your mind? What do you think a story is? Anyone who wants to, you can either put it in the chat or you may unmute and speak. Anybody who would like to give an answer?
Wi-Fi on ಮಾಡಿ ಅದ್ರಾಗ join in ಅಂತಿರಲ್ಲ ಅದನ್ನ.
Okay, that didn't sound like an answer to me, but anyone? Yes. Satbeva, is that your name? Is that how I pronounce it? Yes, please go ahead.
Hello to everybody. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can.
I have listened to the story from the very beginning till the end, and it was very interesting. And your question is about what do I feel about the story? Yes.
Yes. Okay,
I think the first thing I thought about it was the storyteller, the rock. It was actually it wasn't the rock who was telling the story. It was his inner eye, maybe his soul, his another eye that couldn't because of his relationship with the community, he couldn't open his inner talent, his possibilities, his talent. And finally, his inner eye came out and he became a great storyteller.
Wonderful. Wow, that's a very, very interesting interpretation. His inner voice was being, in a sense, manifest in the rock. Okay, great.
Yes, that's what was the first thing I thought about while I was listening. Thank
Wonderful.
you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Anybody else would like to share anything before we move on? No? Okay. Right. So let's go on then. Like I was saying, our discussion is first about what storytelling is. What is a story? What storytelling is? And who is a storyteller? So taking a leaf from this story, let's try to understand what each of these three aspects mean and how they all connect up. So first of all, a story is a journey. Yes, it's a journey in which there are characters that go through some sort of problem and the main character wants something badly, and by the end of the story, he or she has achieved it. And in the character's journey, the listeners are able to see some of their own lives unfold as well. So a story essentially is a vehicle through which we can see our own lives being played out. A story is some form of truth, which is packaged in the form of a beautiful narrative, which maybe, as said by itself, could become quite hard to swallow. But if something is presented in the form of a story, it makes it a little more easy to digest. So stories are essentially truth, but that are well told. A story is also a map of possible roles and worlds that you can occupy and worlds that you did not know existed, but open up because you have just listened to the story and it has revealed to you something that you did not know existed. And so it might then open up your senses to new possibilities. And a story is a mirror through which you can see reflections about life, about your life, about life in general, about the world, about the way it works, and so on. And at this point, I also want to bring attention to a fact that because of all of these powers that a story has, it can also be used as a weapon. Not much is usually talked about it, but storytelling also has a bit of a dark side to it. If used in devious ways, it can be used as a weapon to manipulate and to control the listener or the audience. And we can see examples of that today unfolding right in front of us. You just have to take a look at the news. You'll know how storytelling is being used in manipulative ways. So that's just something to watch out for and be cautious about as consumers of story. And moving on, what is storytelling, therefore? So like the world in which Gaka lived, in which there were no stories, we understand that stories were perhaps the oldest form of communication. And we know this we have enough historical evidence now to suggest that a lot of information was passed on in the form of stories, whether it was in the form of rock paintings that we find from prehistoric times. Stories have always been used to pass on critical information, right? So just imagine a time where you're sitting around a bonfire with nothing to do, and then somebody in that community or that clan wants to come and talk to you about this great hunt that they've had, and gathers everybody around the fire and says, what happened today? I was hiding behind this bush waiting for this lion, and as it drew near, I took out my bow and arrow, and I strung it, waited on my haunches, and then just as the lion came close by, I let my arrow go, and boom, there it was. And now this becomes suddenly a very exciting thing for people in that clan to listen to, because through this story, they're actually constructing meaning of something that they may encounter in the future. All the young hunters listening now know how to go about hunting a lion. Now, if the story was perhaps not shared, they may not have the value of another person's experience through which they can build their own. So through history, we've seen that stories have been used to communicate a lot of critical information, and people have constructed meaning around the world using stories. Now, just like in the story of Gaka and the rock face, storytelling is at its core the building of a relationship. When a story is passed on from the storyteller to the listener, it's based on trust, because the audience somehow believes that the storyteller is going to take them into the unknown world and bring them out of it with a lot of care, and not going to just leave them, high and dry, so to speak. So, and all of this is unsaid. So through the storytelling experience, a bond has been fostered between the storyteller and the listener of the story. So this is what makes storytelling so special. And you could think about the times when you may have been listening to a story told by your grandparents or any of the elders in your family. You're able to conjure up. You may not remember the story itself, but you can actually recall how it made you feel, the closeness that you experienced between the person and who was telling the story and yourself. Now, that's something that stays with you long after the person has gone and long after the story has been told. So essentially, stories help us become closer. So my favorite saying is, the shortest distance between two people is a story. So that's what storytelling is all about. And of course, we know that stories are used to educate, to entertain, and to engage audiences for various purposes. And it therefore becomes a very powerful tool when we talk about education. So more on that a little later. Storytelling helps the listener, and in many cases, very young children to whom stories are being told. It makes them imagine. Therefore, it helps in image making, visualization, and what is called sense making. So we're able to put a whole set of episodes together through the story and make sense of what it means for us in our lives. We may not have had that experience, but stories actually help us connect a lot of dots that we may not have known existed. So stories are able to take us into the unknown and bring us out with a slightly changed or a shift in perspective. And therefore, storytelling is an art. The way in which a story is told is an art form that needs to be practiced and takes years and years of training to get experienced and proficient at. And it's also a science because there's a certain structure for storytelling that makes the brain process the information in a certain way. And we know this from a lot of neuroscience research that is available now, that storytelling actually is a very effective way of communicating something. It could be any concept, it could be any topic, but if it's communicated through the form of a story, the results have been much more impactful. So therefore, understanding how stories work means that you can get straight to the mind and the heart of a person. And now, therefore, who is a storyteller? If stories are everywhere and if they're all around us, we are all storytellers, therefore. But there's a slight difference between who a storyteller is every day, since we all are. We're making sense of this world using stories. Everything in our life is a small story, and all these stories add up and become our grand life story. But there are some people who have chosen to use storytelling for a particular purpose. And in the modern world today, that's perhaps whom you refer to as a professional storyteller. But a storyteller always existed in every indigenous community around the world, whether it was the griots in Africa or the Navajo storytellers of Native America, or in India, you have people like the Baul singers who are also, traditional storytellers, and many other. Every tribe, in fact, had its own storyteller who was a very important person. And that person was seen as the keeper of stories, somebody who received stories from a predecessor and cared for those stories and used them very mindfully, passed them on, under the promise that the stories will be further passed on. So storytellers are people who've had a role to play for many, many generations now. And through the process of being a storyteller, of telling stories, a storyteller is someone who's inherently creative and who has a critical bent of mind. And as people who would now go on to become teachers, all of you, I think this is something to keep in mind, because as a teacher storyteller, these are two very key skills that you are going to be developing in your students through the storytelling medium. And finally, a storyteller. Oh, someone's on a bike.
Okay, I've muted them.
Yeah, all right. And a storyteller is therefore a person who uses their voice, their words, and gestures purposefully. We all have this power, but a storyteller, through training, understands how to use all of these faculties in a more impactful, in a more purposeful way. So these are as far as the definitions are concerned about, what a story is, who a storyteller, what is storytelling, and who a storyteller is. So if you were to put all of this in sort of a Venn diagram, all these three aspects, the story, the storyteller, and the audience, are in this beautiful congruent relationship. And where all of them meet is where the enchantment happens. Now, it's actually very, very challenging to gauge that in a virtual medium such as this. But if we were in the same physical space together, I can feel that energy coming from you as I'm telling the story. And it's the energy from the audience that will feed the storyteller to bring out the story more impactfully. So it's a beautiful sacred relationship in a sense that is created in a matter of, let's say, 5-6 minutes. And that's really the power, which is why we all have to use the power of storytelling very responsibly. Right. So do you have any questions at this point? If you don't, then I can indulge you in another story before we move on to part 2 of the program. Yes? No? Let me stop share so I can see. Okay, so I take it that I can go on with the story?
Yes, we're ready.
Yes, please.
All right. Neo, you're supposed to say Neo if you were listening to the first story. Shall I tell you
Neo.
a story? Once upon a time in Africa, and specifically in Ghana, there was a small town called Akim. And in that town lived a man, a young man, who was tired of living in this small town, which had really nothing for him except a bunch of houses and a field to tend to. And he always dreamed of going to the big city of Accra. Now, Accra was the capital of Ghana. He had heard great things about Accra, so he wanted to journey on and find out. Now, the people in his village stopped him. They said, look, I don't think you're prepared because you don't know the language that the people of Accra speak. And he said, never mind, I will find my way. And so he set off with a little bit of food in a packet that he had taken with him for his journey. And he journeyed on for many, many days, and he walked through the hot desert sand. And as he reached the gates of Accra, he saw a huge herd of cows. He'd never seen anything like this before, certainly not in Akim. Now he stopped the cow herd and he asked him, would you be so kind as to tell me who all these cows belong to? Whom do they belong to? Now the cowherd looked at him and said, Minu. Oh, Minu. Minu must be a very rich man, he said. He thanked him and walked on. And as he walked on further into Accra, he came upon the market. Oh, so many shops selling all kinds of different things, pots and pans and clothes and things to eat. Again, nothing like he had ever seen in Akim. And so he decided to ask another person, who does all of this belong to? And the person said, Minu. Minu again? Minu must be certainly very, very wealthy. He has all these cows and he owns all these shops. Wow, I wish I get to meet Minu someday. And he continued his journey. When he came upon this beautiful building, a huge house, again, nothing like he had seen in Akim. A man was passing by. He stopped him and said, Sir, would you be so kind as to tell me who this beautiful palatial house belongs to? And the person said, Minu. Minu everywhere. Everything in Accra seems to begin and end with Minu. This man must be really something. I wish I could go inside his house and meet him, but I don't think I'd be let in, he thought to himself. And he continued on his journey. And soon he came upon the beach. And in the distance, he could see many ships coming to dock and unloading huge bunches of big ripe bananas. And so our friend went to a person next door, who's standing next to him, and said, "Who do all these ships belong to? Never seen so many ships like this in Akim. I wonder." And the man said, "Minu. Minu, this man really is something. Whoa, I must meet him," he thought to himself somehow. And as he journeyed on in Accra, he came upon a funeral procession. Many people had gathered, and they all seemed very upset, very sad. The women were wailing and crying. Oh, very important person must have passed. And so he went to one of the mourners and asked them quietly, "Who has died?" And the person said, "Minu. Minu. Minu is no more. Minu has all these great things, but just like that, he's gone." Oh. And that day, something shifted inside him. He decided to go back to Akim. And on his way, there was just one thought in his mind. He realized it doesn't matter what you have. It doesn't matter how many houses you own or how many shops you run. You will be gone one fine day. And so life has to be lived to its fullest. And he went back to Akim, a very happy man. Little did he know that in Accra, in the language of Accra, Minu meant, "I don't understand." And that's the end of that story. Right. A bit of a twist in the tale. This is one of my favorite stories. I think it drives home the point that, you think you know everything, but sometimes when you're faced with this huge problem, you just don't know where to begin. And so that leads us to the next section of today's discussion, which is, let me just share my screen again, which is how do you choose stories? Because there are so many stories out there, and you might have your Minu moment. You just don't understand where to begin. So how do you go about this process of sifting through all these stories, and how do you choose the right story to tell? So yeah, there we go, presenting. So there are three ways to look at this. One is from the point of view of you as a teller, and then from the point of view of the audience and the occasion where you are choosing to tell the story. Now, the first thing, which is you as a teller. Now, I cannot overstate the fact that to be able to tell one story, you're just simply going to have to read as many as you possibly can. You perhaps need to read about 15 to 20 stories to be able to find that one story that calls out to you. You might read a story and you might think, "Oh, this is interesting," or "This is really funny," or "This is cute." But not every story would speak to you at a deep emotional level. Not every story would strike the same feeling or the same chord with you as did the other one. So wait for that story that screams out to you and says, "Tell me," and choose that one to tell. Own that story and try to retell it in your own voice. There are tons of stories to pick from the world of folklore, legends, myths, epics, picture books, biographies, what have you. And as students of literature, I don't think I need to tell you more than this, really. You work with stories every day. But look at the first starting point really is for you to connect with the story first. And if you're able to connect with that story at an emotional level, then you will be able to transfer that story beautifully to your audience as well. Now, once you've identified your story, always try to choose a story that you that you might do as you're choosing a gift, something that would be of value to your audience, not just a story because you like it. Your audience need not. So don't be so self-obsessed about it and just go with a story that you like. Think of why your audience might benefit from this story. Think of the points that you may be making with that story. Evaluate the level of the audience and their needs that they may have. And this is specifically true when you're deciding to take stories into the classroom as a teacher. So you may need to spend a lot of time trying to just evaluate whether that story is going to work for your students or your listeners or not. And of course, the occasion in which the story is being placed. Think about where the story is being told, the time, the place of the telling, and think about how the story can enrich the occasion. Is there a theme around which you're going to be telling a story? Is there a history lesson or a history unit that the class is exploring that whole month or that term? Is there a national festival that is being celebrated? Is there an observance? So your stories can add value to all of these occasions. So therefore, choose your stories accordingly. All right. And once you've identified your story, we move on to talking about how do you prepare to tell the story orally. So today our focus is more on telling stories orally, not so much on writing, although I will come to that in the next slide. But when you have the story down, you've read so many stories, you've identified that one that speaks to you. You can't just memorize and tell the story word for word. So a good way to start preparing to tell a story would be to think of it as a set of pictures. See the story in your mind's eye. Look at it like a film. See it unfolding frame by frame by frame. And then you may sit down to make a memory graphic or a story map, as it's called, which is a visual interpretation of the story. It uses only images, maybe very simple stick figures. You don't have to be an artist to be able to do this, but just something that you can look at and be able to identify the important episodes in the story. And then write down what is called the bare bones. Now, the bare bones of a story is perhaps reducing the story to 5 or 6 sentences, right? Like a summary. Just the 5 main aspects of a story that if you were to tell it in 5 sentences, how might you do it? Now, that's a very useful process because it helps you then knock off whatever is not important and only focus on the bits that move the story along. And then you can sit down to think about how to flesh out all the details. So if your story has a character, then what does he or she look like, and what is his everyday life like? And then you slowly start adding the layers as you go on. So once you write down the bare bones, it helps you craft the story in your own way. You may have read it in a certain style, but now is when the story begins to transform and take the shape that you want to give it. And once you've done that and your story is ready, practice telling it out loud many, many, many times. You can tell it when you are in the shower. You can tell it when you're driving to work. I tell my stories into my phone. I like to record it and then listen to it whenever I'm, in a place where I can listen to it without any disturbances. So just listening to the story in my own voice helps me helps me take out all the bits that I don't want, that are not helping the story forward, helps me think about how else I might want to tell that particular part of the story and so on. And definitely don't memorize, because oral storytelling is not about memorizing from a sheet and regurgitating. That is counterproductive to what storytelling is. Let the story flow in your own words, and your audience will know when you memorize the story and you're telling it versus when you've really owned the story and you've made the effort to tell it in your own words. And also, please don't moralize the story. I get asked very often, but what is the moral in the story? You don't have to specifically and explicitly state the moral in the story. That's for the audience to glean out from your story. If you've told it well, then your audience will get exactly what you, the meaning of the story that you intended. So there's really no need to say slow and steady wins the race, or I don't know, honesty is the best policy. All of these things that you will typically hear, at the end of maybe children's stories specifically. So just resist the temptation to moralize a story and leave it out, put it out there for interpretation. And now I'm moving on to talking about, how to tell stories, how to write stories, since many of you are also interested in writing. That's what Vicky told me. You could follow pretty much the same process, but it's a good idea to open the story with a hook, something that might catch the attention of your reader in the very first, minute of reading the story. And needless to say, your characters have to be relatable, something that the reader may be able to identify. Now, of course, all of this is keeping in mind that you're writing stories for children and for young listeners, right? Of course, this can become a very complex process in itself, but I'm placing this in the context of you becoming teachers and therefore telling and writing stories for children. Think of the setting, again, the time and the place, the context of the story. Similarly, flesh out the details like you would for an oral telling, and be prepared to write many, many, many drafts. So it's the same thing that you do when you're practicing to tell a story out loud. You might have to tell it 10 times. Similarly, you may have to write at least 5 or 6 drafts of the story before you're convinced that, this is it. So it has to go through several rounds of critiquing by maybe your peers or your teachers or anybody who you can trust to give you an honest opinion. Put it through that test, and then is when your story is truly ready. Right. Okay. And I want to talk to you a little bit about finding your storytelling voice. Now, what is the way to tell a story? I'm often asked, how do you prepare yourself to tell a story? Now, the simple answer to that is there is no right way, or there is no wrong way, therefore, of telling a story. And there are as many ways of telling a story as there are stories in the world. So that means there are countless ways of telling a story. However, when you listen to many, many storytellers, you will find a style that resonates with you. And that is a style that may be worth pursuing. At the same time, not copying that person's style. So I like to look at your storytelling voice as a continuum, not just this or this, but it can move within that sliding scale, depending on what the story requires. So to begin with, how dramatic should your story be or your telling be? You can move from conversational to theatrical. But remember that storytelling really does not need props, or it does not need flamboyant costumes. It does not need a great stage and, a setup, lights, and so on. But if your story is something that is grand, if you're let's say you're telling an epic and if you want to tell it over many, many days, then you may want to find a style that suits that story. And then, do you want to tell the story from the point of view of the first person or the third person? Again, it depends on what the story requires. You could tell it as, the story of Minu can be told from the point of view of the person who walked into Accra, or it could be told from the point of view of maybe the cowherd who gave this person the answer, Minu, the first time around. Or it could be told from the point of view of the rich man himself, who we don't know who that mysterious person was in Accra. So it all depends on how you want to craft the story. So again, you can move anywhere along this scale, this continuum. But your story will dictate where you should position yourself. Some stories require a certain degree of memorization, especially if they have refrains and if they have chants and if they have, a particular set of words that are important in the culture that the story belongs to, or it could be in a particular language. So those are bits that need to be memorized. Otherwise, keep the story in your words as much as possible. And how do you move from memory to improvising the story? Again, if it's a story that, let's say, for example, you're building with the audience as you're going along. So the inputs that the audience gives you will decide how the story moves forward. So that's improv storytelling, all right? And that's a different genre of storytelling altogether. That won't work for every kind of story, though. Your vocal quality, your voice, as it were, should it be quiet and silent or a calm style, or do you want to be animated and speak in a high-pitched tone and get everyone excited? Again, it depends on the story. If you're telling a personal story, perhaps you want to be, and if it's a story that you want to leave the audience feeling moved, and you want it's let's say a sad story, then you obviously will choose your vocal quality accordingly. You won't say it in a way that gets everyone excited. Yeah. And similarly, your physicalization, how much movement of your body do you want? Do you want to be sitting down, stationary, telling the story, or do you want to be active, moving around here and there? Again, it all depends on how the story needs to be taken to the audience. So not every one of this will not work for every story, which is why practice is so important, which is why truly internalizing the story and understanding what is important for the story is where the work really is. And all of this, of course, comes with watching and observing many storytellers, learning storytelling in a structured way, perhaps, and reading a lot about the theories of storytelling. All of these will help you position yourself. And also there is the same storyteller may do many of these things. Again, I'm not an animated storyteller most of the time, but if the story requires that, and if it's a story that has really moved me, then I have to make the effort to be an animated storyteller for that particular story. So again, it's a decision that you will take as you move from story to story. All right. And now we come to the last portion of the conversation today, which is the role of storytelling in teaching. Since again, many of you are going to become teachers, I thought we could spend some time understanding why stories are important in the classroom. So, needless to say, stories trigger imagination and visualization. We already discussed that at length. Stories help you appreciate a rhythm in language. So there are many stories, like I was mentioning, the refrains and the rhythms, the repetitions some time ago. I can think of this story in which there's a character that, it's a Chinese folk tale, in which the name of the character is Tiki Tiki Tembo, No Sarembo, Chari Bari Ruchi, Pipperi Pembo. Now, when you tell this story to your to very young listeners, it can get them excited and they want to actually, mimic that rhythm. Or, for example, little pig, let me in. No, not by the hair, on my chinny chin chin. So there's all of these inbuilt rhythm patterns that exist in stories, which help, again, develop an appreciation for how the language functions. This is, of course, with respect to English. Stories help increase vocabulary. They help refine speaking, listening, reading, and writing skills. Specifically speaking, because to listen to a story is also helping the audience retell that story. And in retelling is when speaking skills get enhanced. So if you can create an environment in your classroom where you tell a story and you encourage your students to repeat it, or you encourage them to tell it in their own words, then you are building speaking skills alongside. And storytelling can also lead to writing. Now, the first story I told you is a story about how stories came to be. These are essentially called how and why stories or pourquoi stories. Now, these stories can be retold in many ways. That's the advantage of working with folklore. So you might want to tell a story and then get your students to think about similar such stories. So, for example, how did the tiger get its stripes? Or why does the giraffe have a long neck? Or why is the sun up in the sky? Or sun and moon up in the sky? So all of these are interesting writing prompts that will trigger creativity in your children. Yeah. And the next thing is that stories in the classroom allow students to interact on a personal level. I remember telling a story of an ogre once to my class of I think they were third or fourth graders, and I took on the role of a cyclops. Yeah, so this was on Zoom. So in Zoom, you have these very interesting video filters that you can use, and one of them is Cyclops. So I had this big eye on my forehead as I told the story of an ogre that was supposedly my cousin, and I was telling that story to them, and they thoroughly enjoyed it, especially because they saw that the teacher was being goofy, so it gave them an opportunity to see me differently. And when they saw me in school, in person, they actually started calling me Cyclops ma'am. They said, Cyclops ma'am, you're here. It's so nice to see you. So what happens is that it really blurs the line between who you are as a teacher and as a person. They begin to warm up to you a lot more. So, using stories helps you to humanize not just the subject, but yourself as well. And of course, stories develop creative and critical thinking. They help students see literature as a mirror of human experience. So they're able to identify the various emotions that that are possible to go through in this lifetime, whether they may not have experienced it themselves. And through doing that, they're able to understand themselves better and develop empathy towards the other. So feeling for that character, feeling that the character may be going through danger, or wanting that character to come out victoriously in the end, or wanting the character to pay for his or her mistakes. All of these are ways in which you build empathy towards especially people who are not like you. Yeah. So using the story as a tool helps you build these very, very necessary skills, especially in the world that we live in today. And for subjects that are not in the language domain, now we know that language and storytelling go together, but what about subjects like, let's say, geography or maths and science? Do stories have a role to play there? Yes, certainly. Finding stories to tell to make concepts in these subjects come alive makes the subject itself more accessible. I think many of us grow up being math phobic, and that is because the way in which perhaps the subject was taught. And I often think back and wonder what would the classroom have been had my math teacher told me stories. Maybe I would have responded better. I may not have gone on to get a degree in mathematics, but at least it would have helped me look at the subject more favorably. So that's what you want. You want to create the right kind of attitude and the curiosity around the subject more than anything else. And stories can help you do that. Stories can help build a very strong association and memory and schema about a concept, because stories have patterns, and through these patterns, you're able to, build connections between disparate items. So often we find that children remember the stories much better than they actually recall the concepts. So somewhere they have associated the story with the concept, and therefore it's easier for them to recall it. And being able to do this, especially for subjects that they are averse to, reduces anxiety to learning that subject and creates a non-threatening environment in the classroom, especially as you go up the grade level. Often stories are thought of as only for kindergarten or primary grade students. But stories have a very critical role to play even in the middle grade and high school years of a student's learning, because things get so much more complex. But the way that teaching happens does not cater to the multiple needs that a student may have, or a class may have. So using stories therefore becomes an effective tool in those situations. Of course, you can't use stories everywhere. It all depends on whether the concept warrants a story or not. And that, of course, is a subjective decision for the teacher to make. So finally, I'd like to leave you with 3 kinds of stories that are good to keep in your bag. The 3 stories, kinds of stories, would be the who are you or what made you a teacher story. Oftentimes we don't know why we do something, right? Because we don't spend the time to reflect on it. We just do things sort of in like an assembly line, and one day you're thinking back and you're wondering, why am I doing this? What made me a teacher, or what made me a storyteller, for example? So this is a good way to introduce yourself to someone, especially if you're starting a class. How many times have you heard teachers tell their personal stories to you? They get straight into the subject and say, I'm so-and-so, and I'm going to be teaching you social sciences. But telling your students who you are helps them connect with you at the level of a human being first, and then as a teacher. I have a friend who teaches philosophy in a school in the US, and to 3rd graders. So I asked her, well, how is it possible that you teach philosophy to your 3rd graders? And she said, yeah, I tell them a story about how in my childhood, I always had questions about everything, and none of those questions were ever answered by my teachers. And that made the curiosity in me die every day, little by little by little. And I had to fight really hard to keep it alive. And that's when I realized the value of questioning. So she tells their students this story and why she became a teacher, because she really wanted to ask a lot of questions. And this warms them up then to the philosophy class. Then the second kind of story is what I like to call the teaching story. It could be a folk tale, it could be a myth, a legend, whatever, any story that helps you teach a concept or introduce a concept into the classroom. And of course, literature is full of such examples. One just needs to look. And the other kind of story, the third, is the inspiration story, which could be stories like biographies, real life stories, everyday issues, current affairs. All of these are examples of stories that you can take into the classroom and connect to the concept that you want to teach. And of course, this is not just 3 stories. These are 3 kinds of stories. So under each category, you can keep building your story bank, as it were, and keep pulling out from there. This is one bank where you can, the more withdrawals you make, you still have, you don't lose anything. Your deposits remain intact. So try to keep a catalog of stories that you may come across, note them down in a journal or in a notebook, and keep referring to them every time you need to present a story somewhere. So this is actually adapted from a book called The Story Factor by Annette Simmons. She talks about the 6 kinds of stories that every person should tell. And she speaks about it from the point of view of business storytelling. But I thought it's valuable for teachers as well. So I've distilled the 6 to make it 3 for teachers. So these are the 3 kinds of stories there are. And finally, some books that I think may be useful for you to refer to in your storytelling journey. The names are there: The Storytelling Classroom by Sherry Norfolk and Diane Williams, the Storyteller Startup book. This is specifically if you want to perform stories, how do you start, where do you start? So Margaret Reed MacDonald is a noted folklorist, a librarian, and an educator. She lives in Boston, and she's been telling stories she's 80 plus, and she still travels the world telling stories and doing workshops. And she is an encyclopedia of storytelling. She's got many books. One of them is this. And she's also co-written a book with her daughter and her son-in-law, which is called Teaching with Story. That's the one that she's written with Jennifer Whitman and Nathaniel Whitman. So they're also storytellers and teachers. And this book goes into how stories can be used alongside curriculum. So all of these are interesting books to have in the library. Perhaps, Vicky, you may want to pick these up for the Language Center.
Yes.
And yes, so that's the end of my presentation right now. So since we began with a story, it would be nice if we could end with a story. But you have to tell me whether you want to listen to one now.
Yes.
Yes,
Shall
ma'am.
I tell you a story?
Yes, please.
Neo? Okay. So very, very quickly, this one is from a collection of stories by A.K. Ramanujan. And so it goes like this. Once in a village, there lived a man who was uncultured, uncouth, a lout, and he was married to a woman who was very cultured and who had a taste for the finer things in life. And over her years of being married to this man, she was fed up, and she thought, how am I going to get this man to be interested in some kind of refinement? And so one day she heard of this very popular, reputed storyteller who was visiting their village, and he was known for his rendition of the Ramayana. And everybody in the village would go and listen to him every year that he would come. And of course, the Ramayana, being the epic that it is, would go on for many, many, many days and nights. So somehow she convinced her husband to go and attend this storytelling session. The first night, when the man went, he fell asleep. And now by the end of the canto for that particular evening had been recited, sweets were distributed, as was custom. And this man was sleeping so sound, he had no idea that the story for that day had come to an end. And someone had put the sweet in his mouth as well. And in his sleep, he had eaten it. And when he realized it was morning, so he had to go back home. And when his wife asked him, so how was it? How was the experience? He said, it's sweet. It was sweet. And she was a bit satisfied. She thought, right, this man is now slowly beginning to receive the story nicely. And the second night when he went, he leaned against a wall to listen to the rendition of the Ramayana. Now, as he did the previous night, he leaned against the wall and went off to sleep. Now, since the place was very crowded, a little boy who was curious to listen to the story came up and he sat on this man's shoulders for the whole night. And by the time this man woke up after the session had ended, he began to feel aches and pains on his back. And then he went home. His wife asked him, so how was the story yesterday? And he said, oh, it was very heavy. She thought, he's truly taking the story in. The weight of the story is beginning to enter his being, she thought. And so the third night, he slept as usual. And that night, a little dog that had found its way through the crowd sat next to him. And as dogs do, this one did its business right next to him, and some of it was sprayed in his mouth as well. And when he got up, there was a salty taste in his mouth, and it was around the time that the storytelling was ending. He went home, trying to figure out what this bad taste in his mouth was. When he went home, his wife asked him, "So, how was it today?" And he said, "It was very salty." Salty? Now she knew something was amiss. How can the story be salty? And so the next night, finally, she decided to accompany him. And so she sat right in the front with him, making sure that he stayed awake, paying attention to every word the storyteller was telling that day. And that night was the night when he was reciting the part where Hanuman flew across the ocean and was about to retrieve Rama's ring that he had dropped. And so the storyteller was in his element, reciting the very exciting episode of the Ramayana. And as Hanuman jumped into the ocean, looking for all those rings, looking for Ram's ring from the many thousands of rings that were, he didn't know what to pick. And this man, overcome with emotion, he said, I will pick Ram's ring. And so saying, he jumped into the ocean himself and he came out with the ring in his hand. And everyone around him was amazed. They thought, oh, this man is truly blessed. Where did he get Ram's ring that the storyteller was only talking about, they thought. And after that day, he became a very well-respected man in the village. He developed a great interest in the Ramayana. And so they say, when you truly listen, magic can happen. And that's the end of that story. So with that, I have finished my little bit. It was a very long bit.
It was a great bit. It was everything that I wanted it to be. I'm so inspired.
Thank you so much.
I have to definitely start reading more stories and finding more stories to put into my own repertoire. Okay, so let's, I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I don't want to disregard questions that you might have. Although
Yes,
you covered
please.
every topic so well. It was so wonderful to see the characteristics and the ideas of even the voice, how to choose the voice. It was so informative. It really impacted me a great deal. Thank you, Deeptha. Okay, so I'll stop talking. Also, if you can raise your hand, or you can put a question in the chat, whatever works for you if you have a question. Or if you, okay. Satyabayeva?
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I guess you often use storytelling in your classes as is a storyteller. I think your students are also the storytellers most of the time, right?
Yes. Yes, go ahead. Please finish the question. Yeah.
Do your students, are your students storytellers often, I'm asking?
Right.
And
yeah.
if they are, do you give some rules, or do you tell them in what way are they going to reproduce it or tell the story? Do you fix it beforehand, or how do you ask them to do that?
Right, that's a great question. So it really depends on what the objective for that session is. If it's a writing unit that you're doing with your children, and which is like I was giving you the example of Pourquoi stories or how and why stories. If the objective is for them to come up with their own original how and why story, then we write out rubrics for that assignment specifically to ensure that they meet all the criteria that you're looking for in a particular pourquoi story. So and much before that, of course, you have to explain to them what the parts of a pourquoi story are. So what happens typically in a how and why or a pourquoi story? There's a creature or there's a phenomenon that does not have the qualities that it has today. For example, how did the elephant get its long nose? So you start with the elephant not having a long nose, and then something happens and the elephant's nose becomes long. And that's why all elephants today have a long nose. So this becomes like a template. So there's a creature which does not have the feature we see it today. Something happens, a result of which the creature has the kind of, the feature that we see today. So you give them this template or this checklist and encourage them to write along these lines, along this format. And then the rubric helps you determine whether they have met all of these criteria. And then you can check for things like language and grammar and, style and so on and so forth. So yes, in writing, one needs to give a certain structure. You have to scaffold that process before you get them to write. Otherwise, it's going to be all over the place. And the same with telling as well. This is not just for writing, even for telling a story orally, it's pretty much the same format or the same process. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes. And one more question, please.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Do they often have to read the stories, or sometimes they create their own stories?
Can you repeat the first part of your question again?
Do they often have to read the stories, or do they create those stories themselves?
So they would have to read stories initially. They have to read quite a few or listen to quite a few for them to understand how the story is built before they set out to create their own, right? But for very young children, anything that happens in their lives is a story. They communicate it in the form of a story, right? So coming back home from school and telling the parent about what happened is essentially storytelling. So while there is a natural process of storytelling that happens in every child and in every human being, when it comes to doing it in a certain way, when you want to put a structure to it, then it helps to get them to read a lot, to get them to listen to a lot of stories, see the patterns that are emerging, and then try to create their own.